Hey everyone, this is another episode of the Business of Education. As you know, I'm Kyle Walgren. Today, my host comes all the way from Australia, so we woke her up nice and early for you guys to be able to experience some of the information she brings to the table. But our guest today is Fleur Johnston, who comes with 20 years experience in the workforce and technology space. She's the founder of Peoplebench, and she focuses on data science to strengthen Australia's teaching workforce. Fleur, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kyle. It's great to be here.
Fleur, I'm excited to talk to you just because my focus has been in America for the most part, but education is a global problem. I'm going to call it a problem, but a global initiative that, we're all working to better. I have friends in Australia that use EdSoma every day. But, I want to reach out and see what other people are challenged with education around the world. You guys focus on the teacher side of things, right? Tell us a little bit about what Peoplebench does.
Yeah. So we're one of those edtech companies, which I guess sits across a couple of categories. We're an edtech and we're also an HR tech. And so education's been a really interesting space to be in for the last decade or so, just a little more, mainly because so much of the edtech landscape is focused on the student, on curriculum, on innovative ways to do pedagogical approaches. And we know that students are at the centre of everything we do in schools. But we also know that 80% of the cost of running a school is the adults who turn up to make schools possible every day. And I guess that's where my background's been, and that's how we found ourselves working with schools here in Australia.
So you mentioned that you started in Australia. You also mentioned that 80% of the spend's on the adults in the room, the staff that teach our students. But just before we start talking, you guys have recently moved to America as well, right?
Yes, we have. Yeah. So we took our first scalable version of our product to market in Australia here in 2019, just before, we all know what happened at the beginning of 2020. But already we had some interest out of the US at that time. And I think, Carl, that was mainly because we're a research-based company. So Peoplebench was bootstrapped out of a prior business that I had working in management consulting. We're experts in workforce strategy and organisational redesign and change. And schools had been working with us for quite some time in Australia, particularly looking at the challenges they were having attracting and retaining their workforce. So we kind of got into schools by accident. They were looking for solutions from providers that were advising other community impact sectors. So we had a lot of experience in health, community services, aged care, and they have a lot of the same features when it comes to workforce. It's high emotional intensity work. It's high discretionary effort. We engage with students and parents and community. They're complex and ambiguous, and that makes the jobs and the role design and the work complex. And so we were working with schools initially. We started as a pro bono research project with some rural and regional schools here in Australia. And we were looking at that big question, what does a high impact school workforce look like? And we were pretty amazed when we looked at the research internationally, and looked at research from people like Professor John Hattie here in Australia, who looks at all of the macro factors, what makes a high impact learning environment for students. And so few of them were to do with staff. And we were really curious about that because, again, when we know that 80% of the cost of running a school is staff, we wondered why researchers weren't looking at this more closely. And of course, since that time, they have been. And it's a fantastic time to be working on school workforces as a topic and with a technology solution to help those conversations, because the research is maturing, the technology is maturing, and the sector's practices are maturing. Yeah.
So I've never talked with anybody that has a focus on the staff. It's always been the students, but the number one thing is buy-in, right? Like the number one challenge that the majority of the founders that I've talked to is teacher buy-in, where that's not, necessarily your problem with building your company because you're supporting the staff from the ground up. What are some of the bottlenecks that you guys run into dealing with teachers on the other side are I guess more administration on the
Yeah.
other side from a startup position or an ed tech company.
Yeah, I think for us, Kyle, we're actually creating a new category. And that's probably the biggest challenge for us. There's a deep knowing across the sector that there are hair on fire issues to do with attraction and retention. And at the moment, all that's available in the market are point solutions. So there's a thing which, might measure what's going on in staff satisfaction, or a thing that might measure what's going on in staff culture. Or we've got HR and payroll systems that measure boring things, not to people like me, not to nerds like me, but boring things like attraction rates and retention rates and qualification and diversity profile. The reality is that that's all really important information for senior administrators, for school boards, for district administrators, but also for principals who are managing those complex issues in their buildings. That's really important information for them to have their eyes on. And so we built a product which puts that information in front of them. But then the next challenge, the next bottleneck is, how do we differentiate that from any other products that are putting that data in the hands of those leaders? And the answer to that for us was, well, many of the other products in market are not actually then leading our senior leaders to know what to do with the data. And so that's the product that we built. We built a product that helps them develop their workforce strategy and then be successful in implementing it at a district as well as at an individual building level. So the bottleneck for us has really been that there is an education component of the buying market, but it's one that's fairly straightforward in the sales conversation because the problem is so hair on fire, and because everybody in administration can relate to the fact that at the moment they've got a complex landscape of point solutions and they need to be able to bring it all together.
When you're focusing on retention and that aspect of things, and I guess you're seeing the data from Australia and the US, is Australia having the same issues bringing new teachers into the education space as what we're seeing in America in real time?
Yes, and so same but different. This is actually a global crisis. So in 2016, UNESCO predicted we'd be 69 million teachers short for the needs of K-12 kids across the world. Those numbers have been adjusting, and actually, optimistically, internationally, that number is slowly starting to improve. It took a rapid change in predictions through that COVID period, but it's starting to look a little more positive internationally. But when we take markets like the US and we take markets like Australia, we can see that we're not on an upward trajectory right now. And in the US, you have some additional complexities. You have different structures in terms of pay points, in terms of job families and role types. But ostensibly, the challenge is the same, and that is that as a sector, schools haven't really kept pace as contemporary places to work. And what that means is the way we've designed the work in jobs, the way the industrial framework sets up around those jobs, all of those pieces haven't really kept pace with the way those discussions have moved in other community impact sectors. And so, that's a challenge, but it's also a massive opportunity for everyone involved, because there's things we can learn from other sectors. And then we've been really fortunate to work with incredible leaders who want to co-design, adapting some of those ideas from other sectors and bringing them into the education sector. And yeah, that's where we're having our successes.
That's awesome. So if I heard you right, you said 2016 we were 69 million educators short globally?
No, in 2013, so this is quite some time ago, UNESCO was already predicting a 69 million teacher shortfall for the needs of K-12 kids across the globe.
To put that into context, that's like 2 times the population of Canada.
Right.
That we're short, or they're projecting to be short for teachers. And I think we're feeling that, teachers come into a space with intentions to impact and change the young minds of America and the world. And then find that they're like really unappreciated once they get there. Right. What are some of the trends that you're seeing, or is there trends that you're seeing with the data that you're collecting, where certain districts retain educators better than others? And if there are, what are some of those trends that you're seeing?
Yes, sure. So there are a lot of factors, right? The first product that we built was a workforce benchmarking tool, and it looked at some of those boring indicators. And HR practitioners and people in culture, nerds and scientists, look at some of that boring data. We look at the turnover statistics. We look at the frequency of recruitment. We look at the rate that the adults in schools take leave and what reasons they take leave for. So there's some basic clues in that data. Psychological injury claims is another thing. Every district has to pay significant fees for insurances, healthcare cover, all of those sorts of things. And those premiums are affected by how many claims there are for either psychological or physical injury. You know, in some parts of Australia, and some of the data in the US is the same, the rate of slips, trips and falls in schools is as high as it is on construction sites.
Oh, wow.
I'll just let that sink in for a minute. And as workforce practitioners, when we see data like that, we go, okay, there are some basic workforce conversations and approaches that aren't in place that could do better on those metrics. And psychological injury claims are long tail things. They tend to last for a long time. They're very costly for the individuals and the organisations involved. So if we can bring those numbers down, we're returning dollars back into districts and states to put at the front line into learning, into pedagogy being improved, into adoption of AI, and other technologies that then have knock-on effects to improve the way the work is to do for the adults. So it's absolutely synergistic. One of the other data points that we look at, Kyle, through COVID, we were doing all of that workforce benchmarking from payroll and HRIS systems, and the wellbeing discussion really came to the front through COVID. And we'd been doing work for quite some time with a fantastic psychometrically validated scale to measure adult resilience in the workplace. And so through COVID, we turned that into an edtech specific product that we've been able to scale across whole systems of schools to get a pulse on how are the adults travelling on 7 factors that we know relate to behaviours like turnover. So in a model like that, we can look at how people feel lined up with their values, whether they feel lined up with purpose in schools, and those things are always high. We built a tool during COVID which allowed us to measure 7 factors of resilience in adult workforces. And that point is really important. So what we found when we were working with schools where they were trying to do good stuff for the wellbeing of their adults, they were taking their programs and products designed for students and hoping that by expanding that out across the adults, that would make a difference. But what we know from the adult behavioural science research, specifically about workplaces, so from workplace and industrial and organisational psychology, is that the types of conversations that we need to have with adults in a workplace are in fact a bit different to the general wellbeing conversations that we would have with students going on their maturational journey as they grow up through their K-12 years. So this scale is specifically about adults, and the first couple of factors it measures is aligning with our values and being very closely connected with purpose. Now, those 2 factors line up with specific bodies of research, which, if they're high, we know that that's a good thing. And if they're low, they're a little clue about some of the organisational things that we can do as leaders or as individuals in any job in a school so that we can connect people better to the conversation around values and purpose. Now, schoolies generally do really well on that stuff. You basically—
I was going to say that's usually why people become teachers is purpose and value.
Right, exactly. Now, this model has 7 factors, okay? And what we know is that if we don't attend at some level to all of the factors, then we're probably playing one or more of our strengths so hard that it's to the detriment of the others. So if I keep going around the model, the 3rd factor in the model is maintaining perspective. And again, there's a ton of research around this. All the positive psychology stuff fits here. The cognitive behavioural ideas that came from amazing researchers like Martin Seligman at UPenn. All of that fits in here. And this is the idea that we can reframe experiences in our workplace in a way that allows us to return back to a place that we can keep doing the work. So the bounce back kind of idea fits nicely in this third factor. I don't want to spend the whole podcast taking you through the whole model, Kyle, but when we look at the 7 factors, so those couple around values and purpose, maintaining perspective, interacting cooperatively is another one. Educators are great at offering their help all of the time, but this is a two-way concept. And we got to be good also at asking for help and set up cultures that are defined by things like psychological safety. When we feel okay to ask for help or express an alternate view, all of those things contribute to whether we feel like we're having to use a lot of our emotional and cognitive resources every day just to keep going, or that we actually are operating at a level where we can keep going and we can bounce back well when we have change, challenge, or setback. So 7 factors. We built a tool which measures these factors at scale across the school workforce. It's quantitative data rather than the qualitative data that tends to come back with an engagement survey or an opinion survey, etc. By getting quantitative data back, we're giving leaders a picture of which groups of staff need most support and what type of support they might need. And so they can very clearly take appropriate action. You know, a classic high turnover profile is one where in the HR data we'll see there's high turnover, and in the resilience profile we'll see probably really high on values and purpose and really low on things like mastering my stress, or perhaps the interacting cooperatively one, or the factor which is around maintaining my health, so eat right, sleep right, move right. When we start to compromise our relationships and our physical health, no matter how committed we are to purpose and values aligned, it's very difficult to keep going over a long, sustained horizon. And they're the basic concepts in resilience in a workplace. And that's the kind of tool that we built, and we're finding that leaders are adopting and being able then to have specific conversations with staff, which is improving not only their sense of resilience, but it's improving important metrics like turnover.
The one thing you brought up was psychological safety. Did you guys have enough data prior to COVID to see if there was a massive change in that prior to it happening and then coming back into school after it was happening?
No, would be my answer. Not at scale across the edtech sector. So that data does exist across multiple industries. The other thing I would say to you is it's pretty context specific, right? Okay. So every school is in fact its own workplace. And that's part of the challenge when we're rolling out district solutions, because every human system operates at a number of levels. It operates at the individual level. It operates at the organisational level, which is the leader that I report to. And if we think about a school context, we can think about an individual building as an organisational level, and then at a systemic level. And there are factors at play at systemic, organisational and individual level, all of which we need to have an eye on. And when we're talking about good leadership, leaders at each of those levels need to have an awareness at each of those levels. So rolling out a district-wide strategy around wellbeing, which often is professional learning, assuming that the same professional learning for everybody is going to shift the needle, is one of the challenges we have in getting a good return on investment when we put public money into those solutions. Being able to be very sensitive and see that, for example, within one school, I've been running an engagement survey for the last 10 years, and I can tell you that, and this is an actual case study, so I don't want to be down on maybe women who are like me, but middle to more mature aged women may be able to express through our staff meetings and our sentiment surveys that we're tired and we really need a break and we're having trouble, managing XYZ. This is what we think we need to do. So a principal might think that that group of staff is the group that needs most support and is focused on that. It's like the loudest voice, right?
Right.
But in fact, in this particular case study, when they took their resilience data, it was their youngest men who were struggling hardest.
Oh, wow.
And it lined up with their retention data. And we all know when we see school workforce profiles, men generally, and in particular, early career men working in earlier years education are super, super rare and high turnover. And so when we grab that data, you can look at it and know, well, probably district administrator training on wellbeing is not going to fix that problem. But a principal being able to talk to the young men working in his school or her school about what's going on and finding out that, in fact, they'd all just become dads. Several of them were sleep deprived. Most of them were really questioning, should I be in education? Is there something
I was literally going to ask you, like, what was the context behind these young men? Because my head started going a million miles an hour between what, even men look like today from my age demographic to like what I see 25 to 30-year-old, that it's just changed dramatically. So please dive into that a little bit.
And so some of the things you do then, I imagine, is you go looking for support, and it's probably your support networks outside of school, which is good. That's actually an important feature in being a resilient adult, having diverse networks. But as a leader in that school, trying to stem the tide of turnover and also improve the diversity profile of their workforce, what was required was a conversation with the young men who were the group that was struggling hardest to learn that what they needed was support as early career educators and new parents. And they set up a young dads parenting group and assigned them male mentors who were further along in their career, and they retained the whole group. So
wow.
That's a little example of why we need individual building data and why we have to work at a district level to introduce some of the processes of contemporary workforces that have been used in other sectors but haven't been used in education yet. And that's why we're so optimistic about the work, Kyle, because we haven't tried all the things yet. And so trying them is where the hope lies, and seeing the impact that it's having is very, motivating.
It's very fascinating. Like when so a lot of my team does a lot of the research on bringing the new guests onto the show. I have a startup just like you do, and I'm focused on my day to day, but I love having these conversations. So they find, interesting people like yourself to bring on the show. And when they brought me this, I'm like, how is this going to align with what we're doing? But I think I've learned more in the last 23 minutes talking to you about this than probably the majority of our edtech founders. Like, I would have never thought that the retention problem would be in young males. And when you said this, like my mind went somewhere totally different than young dads. Like I would have thought of like a more feminine, less masculine male coming into the education space, maybe, but like totally didn't go for the new parent. Like I just didn't go there.
But we do take our whole selves to work, right? And every individual within that organization, within that system, is constantly weighing what's going to work for me, what's going to work for my family, even more so now. And we know that those things generationally have shifted as well.
Right.
So it's really important that we have eyes on this, and not that we just have eyes on it as governing boards or administrators through a risk lens, although we should. And boards actually do, and senior administrators do know that accountability sits with them, and they desperately want to be able to better see where the risks and opportunities lie. And so that's the space that our product sits in. But you asked me about challenges and roadblocks, and the challenges and roadblocks are that classically school administrators haven't had a product like this available to them. And as a consequence, even in the way we do our leadership development in the sector, what we're talking about is actually workforce strategy. So districts and schools are really good internationally at coming up with strategic plans. And they usually have one pillar that's about the adult humans. So there's usually a pillar about teaching and learning. There's another pillar about the running of the system in some way. And then there's usually a third pillar, depending on whether they've got 3 or 5, which is about people. But then we drop to tactics and operations, and we're just going to try to get a maths teacher, or most folks that work with schools will have spoken to an administrator who will say to them, I'm just trying to get a warm body for next week to be in a classroom. So that's where we're at internationally. And we know that that's not good enough for our kids or our communities, and educators know that's not good enough. And so everybody wants to solve this problem, and it's a fantastic one to be part of.
I've often used that term warm body with the shortage. Literally somebody was working at the grocery store last week. Now they're teaching our kids how to read and write because there has been this mass shortage, and what I'm learning globally, not just nationally. But one of the things that I know that we focus on within our organization is culture. Is there a way for you guys to gauge culture? And then when I was thinking about this, it's almost like set upon two different resources, right? Because the students play a huge role into culture, how the school is on top of the staff, right? So in a school, and I never thought about this before, you're fighting two cultural battles within, providing a safe environment or an enjoyable work environment. Do you have any information or data on that and how that plays a role?
Yeah, we do. So interestingly, in the development of our platform, the first product was the workforce benchmarking on all of those boring metrics I just talked about. And I shouldn't call them that. They're actually the metrics that matter. They're the metrics that we know.
I guess I'm a boring person because I found them super fascinating. So
they're important metrics for us to have our eyes on. And then there's the missing metric, which was the resilience metric, which, before now we couldn't measure that at scale, but that's the product we've built, and we can measure that at scale across a large workforce. And that all feeds, of course, into what it is like to work in a school. So we do a lot of work with systems that are looking to improve the culture and climate, but we're really careful again to nest this inside the broader conversation about workforce strategy. So the thing that is actually missing is workforce strategy. And workforce strategy is the sum total of all of the things that we're going to do along the hire to retire life cycle to make these attractive places to work so that we can attract and retain people who can do great work and maintain their well-being over a sustainable horizon. So if I put all of those long words into short words, our little company mantra is making schools amazing places to work so they can be amazing places to learn. Because we know in the literature that that's actually the case. The connection to the student, we know through the literature that the single greatest in-school factor predicting outcomes for kids in their learning is the quality of the teacher and the relationship that the student has with them. So that is the number one thing that we've got to focus on. But we've got to be really careful if we get strayed into the conversation about teacher quality, that we don't place the burden of that at the foot of individual teachers. The burden of that is at systemic improvement level. It's about making sure that we are doing all of the right things when it comes to attraction, retention, culture, well-being. So to answer your question, yes, we have a tool in our platform that measures culture. A bit like the resilience tracker, it's not something I ever thought I would be building, Kyle. I was a HR director and worked in executive roles in very large government agencies for a long time before I co-founded my first business 13 years ago, and that's where we bootstrapped Peoplebench from. But some of my frustration when I was working in those big systems was that if I wanted to measure culture or even do leader measurement, or even look at my HR metrics, I was always dealing with very big, expensive, like multi-million dollar system implementations. What frustrated me was not putting the tools in the hands of the people who actually have to lead the complex conversations. And if we bring that across into education, that's actually principals. It's principals and assistant principals. It's middle leaders and leaders who have to front up at the school gate and know everybody's name and, will be the person held to account if someone's parent's not happy. So they're the folks that need the support and need the data. The culture piece, we were aware that there are other products in market that measured culture. When our school clients came to us to talk about them, they told us two things. One, either they were too expensive to scale, which is a bit like the workforce strategy problem. Before we built Peoplebench, the only way you could do workforce strategy in a school was to hire an expensive consultant, which is what we used to do. And the system would buy it, but it would become a piece of paper that sat at the system level, and it would make no difference to the principal. So we built a tool to roll that process down to principals. And the culture piece came in then because, again, buying existing products to measure culture at scale was too expensive for systems to invest in. And also, those products often assume that there's someone in HR to interpret the data and help leaders work out what to do with it. So we did end up building a culture tracking tool. It's about to be released in the US. We'll be releasing that later this year. But that one's been being used in Australia for the last 18 months. And that tool very simply looks at the alignment of things like my personal values from the resilience model with the way we see values being lived out in the school. And we can see that on our dashboard with two circles. You know, when those two things are close, the circles overlap, and we want a high degree of overlap. But when they don't overlap and those things are far apart, then that drains people. It depletes their resources and it depletes their ability to have a resilient response and show up and do great work every day. So there's a big connection between culture and resilience. And that's why we built products inside of our stack to be able to measure those data points. But I will also say our product philosophy is not competitive in that space. We don't put ourselves forward as a survey company, although we have some survey tools. Our product core is actually the strategy piece. And so it's a fantastic opportunity to be able to collaborate with people who do capture that data, because there are other beautiful products in the survey space. Yeah.
And I'm definitely going to share this. I feel like I could make 100 introductions to people, to schools that would really value from this.
We would love that, Kyle.
I'm definitely going to tell some people about this, I promise you. And the majority of the people that follow us online are educators, administration leaders, you know, a lot of young founders though. So I want to pivot a little bit. You've built a couple companies now. Your last company is bootstrapping this new project that you're doing. But we still, as founders, as CEOs, as business leaders, lose sleep at night over certain items. You know, building this company, what keeps you up at night?
The fact that the sun goes around an entire planet and you guys are awake when we're generally asleep. That keeps me up at night.
Pretty good one. I like that answer. A lot of the people that I talk to are early on in their career. They're just like trying to find product market fit. You know what I mean? So right. I know that different things at different stages of your business affect people differently, right? So a lot of our young founders are raising capital that, you know, so they're usually majority of their problems are financial problems or trying to understand how to talk to people about hard conversations. I was told at a young age, the hardest part about building a business is having conversations nobody else wants to. So
that's a great point.
I focus on that. You know, if there's a conversation that I don't want to have, it just kind of tells me it's the one that I need to have the most. So, that's one thing, but then networking, I bring people together. That's my number one goal behind this podcast, is to bring people together, to bring insights on what other people are working on and be able to expand my reach, because I've been blessed with a lot of influential people in my network. How important is your network to what you're doing, and how do you leverage it?
You do nothing alone. Like, you do nothing alone. I mean, first of all, there's the team that you work with to build whatever it is you're building. And every day you are not qualified for the job that you are doing now, or the job that you know you're probably going to be doing next week, because actually you've got no idea what job you'll be doing next week.
That's the truth.
And we're a little bit like plumbers with leaky taps in that regard. Like, the thing that we are expert in is designing organizations. So designing our organization and learning how to be a SaaS company has definitely been our steepest, and continues to be our steepest learning curve. I think the networking question, if I just take the piece of this business, which has been about growing into the US, I think I mentioned there was interest in our research pre-COVID. During COVID, we slowed down and just focused on working with our incredible clients here in Australia on these endemic problems across the education space. And as the world started to thaw after COVID, we were fortunate to secure a grant, federal government grant here in Australia, to pilot some ideas in the US. During that period of time, I mean, the networks in the US, Jen Ferrari at ERDI was one of our first networks and connections. She has been so incredibly supportive. She was one of those relationships where, we all thought we were about to meet one another and then no planes went anywhere for a while. So we all met online. So that relationship and the network that's come through those networks of superintendents and senior administrators was foundational. Independent of that, being part of an Australian CEO founder network, EduGrowth here in Australia, and David Linke. David does a fantastic job of bringing Australian founders together. And it was in that forum that I met Rita Ferrandino, who I think
Rita
on the podcast, and is how we know one another now. Yeah.
Oh, right. That's how we got introduced. Yes, that's right.
That is how we met.
Yes.
So
sorry. Rita has introduced me to so many people.
Right.
Yes, Rita is a blessing. Like, I talk to Rita every day via text, and if anybody that listens to this doesn't know Rita, they need to. That's all
Everybody
I can say.
Everybody needs to know Rita. Agree.
But, oh, yes. Sorry, I gapped out on that. But yes, Rita was the one that brought us together.
She did. And then Rita introduced us to the University of Pennsylvania, and John Gamber, who's the entrepreneur in residence there, was kind enough to give me a little bit of his time when I clicked on the Calendly link and hoped to get a little bit of time with John. And John has just become an incredible John I don't even have words for how inspirational, supportive, and incredible he has been in facilitating both the connections that we needed to establish the research relationship with UPenn. So we've just finished an incredible piece of research with 4 districts of school using the resilience tracker. And we're just about to put another application together to do a much more substantial body of research with the university. And then, the generosity of people like Rita and John. There you go. There's a new term, generosity. Rita and John have just introduced us to so many wonderful people like yourself, Kyle. And it's really just grown from there.
Now that you said that, and I'm going to make sure to take note or bring the notes to who set up these podcasts, because I do ask, like, at the end of every podcast, hey, could you recommend 2 people that you think I would have a good conversation with? Now I know why I'm so engaged in this conversation, because Rita knows who I am. So she knows who I'm going to thrive having a good conversation with. You know what I mean? So it totally makes sense now. So, but I'm going to make sure that I start adding that to my notes, who set this up, because then I know how intense the conversation's going to be. And it's literally like I get certain introductions from certain people, and it's going to be like one level of energy. And then a different introduction is really, really intellectual conversation that I've really got, like, it really intrigues me. So it's interesting to see just the difference between the introductions, or who that introduction comes to from, the depth of what that conversation is going to transpire into.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. So absolutely, Kyle. I mean, networking is just essential. And those networks that we've just talked about have been the non-educator networks. The educator networks are obviously foundational, because then we hear founders of all SaaS companies and tech types, one of the biggest mistakes we can make, and we've ventured into making them before, and we constantly are alive to and wondering if we might inadvertently make the same mistake again, is building something that people don't want to use, because that's expensive aside from anything else. It takes you away from your main game. So, I think
time's your number one resource that you can't get back. So,
right. So being able to really deeply engage and find those customers who want to engage with you as an innovative technology coming into the space, and it goes back to the sales cycle as well, being able to quickly identify if this really is an ideal customer or not. I mean, in the early days, you definitely, and when you're going into a new market, you kind of take every customer that's going to engage with you.
Yes.
but knowing very quickly about whether they're the type of customer who will engage more deeply with you in an authentic conversation about, there's a hair on fire problem that no one's solved. We are earnestly trying to solve it and know we can't do it on our own. Will you be one of those clients who will continue to co-design the next edge of this with us? I think if your product, I like to imagine that maybe I could have built a product that already had a market well defined and we were just sort of going in as the best of that category. But
that wouldn't have been
the reality is, in making a new, in having something that is genuinely new and innovative, you are constantly having to create it at the front edge as you go. So, yeah, I'd be interested in your experience or thoughts on that, Carl.
So I didn't dive into an area that was new, but it was new to me. And
Right.
I don't come from education at all. I don't come from technology at all. I've spent my entire career building businesses from the age of, I think, 22 or 3 was when I started my first company. I'm now 13 businesses in my entrepreneurial career.
Amazing.
Some have worked, some haven't. I've learned more from the ones that didn't work than the ones I did work. But the one that with this company, the thing that I love about education technology is that it's so much bigger than yourself. And the people that you communicate with come from a more passionate, well-defined, purpose-driven perspective that it's, invigorating every time you have a conversation with them. You know what I mean? So if you ever are feeling like founder burnout or whatever that looks like, have a conversation with another edtech founder because they will shower their motivation or their inspiration onto you. And it just gives you all the energy back in the world because they're all there. It's all purpose driven. And I think that's the one thing that I've loved the most about the edtech space. And Rita is the perfect example of that. When I met Rita was at an edtech conference and she was a judge at the pitch. And she walked into the room. She knew that everybody was nervous. So she just started dancing on stage. And that was how she lightened up the environment and everybody went out. They felt loose. And, she's just made such a huge impact. And it's people like Rita that makes the education space fun and rewarding because it's very, very tough. You know what I mean? You mentioned on sales cycles and investing your time into sales cycles and, identifying early on if that client will actually be convertible. And you're right. I spent a lot of time. I spent 9 months with the first customer that we had through that, building that relationship, showing them the product, rolling it out, learning how to ask the right questions. That being said, I didn't come from education or education sales. So I had a lot of learning personally there.
Yeah, I relate.
So there was a lot of learning there personally. Now, and I guess because I've committed my life to this outside of my kids, and my wife, I've committed my life to this. I can now see early on where I want to invest my time. And people will go to bring me into conversations. And it's not that I don't care to talk to everybody. It's that that's not going to be worth my time having that conversation. I'm not going to stop you from whatever you see value there, but I already know that isn't the direction I need to go. And you learn that early on because time is so critical when you're building a new company. So,
and I think you touched on the sort of pressures of fundraising. I think for us anyway, in the fundraising components of what we've done, bridging the gap between, and I think my impression is certainly coming from the Australian market where the investor landscape is much smaller. And then when you consider those folks that are looking for education investments in their portfolios,
makes it even smaller
again. That was really challenging for us early on. However, once you get to a size where you can attract more significant investment, the landscape's as it is anywhere around the world, and the fact that we have US back as well now radically changes. So that's a real milestone to be able to get to that place to have investors in Australia and in the US. And I think for me, a bit like you maybe, Kyle, I knew nothing about selling into the education sector. And, you know, the only selling I had done, I was a career public servant. My selling was when I was putting myself through university and I was working in fashion retail stores. And I was grateful that I was shoved out the back of big, you know, Just Jeans kind of, I don't know what the equivalent in the US would be, with the, you know, sign in the staff room that was as big as 2 dressing rooms with your 6 points on how to sell kind of card on the wall. I remember being grateful that I'd learnt that when I then went into public administration, because the process of sales, the way we have a sales conversation, is relevant whether you're selling something for money or because it needs to be adopted as a policy idea or whatever that is. Getting people bought in and willing to invest in something with you, it is that process. But then running my first company as an advisory practice, that's a pretty generic kind of a simple business model in advisory services with simple ratios and all of that sort of stuff. Learning about SaaS companies and then the subsection of SaaS, which is edtech, has been, all of it is brand new. And so finding people in your network again who can tell you whether what you're doing should look like and does look like what they've seen be successful before is so important. But the metrics, the sales cycle in education, you know, we've got 2 categories of customers because it's such a hair on fire problem. In that first window coming into the US, I think our record at the moment was 5 days on an enterprise sale, contract to contract.
That's amazing.
Now that was an outlier, but what we've got now is kind of 2 groups that move through. We've got groups that this is hair on fire and I will find money under cushions to buy it because I have to fix this problem. If I can slow down teacher turnover, so the cost of turnover is between 0.4 and 1.5 times an annual salary every time a staff member leaves an organisation. And it's a very loose metric because there are so many variables which affect it. But in the literature, there is a range that's about that wide. So it's quite simple to do a calculation on the back of the napkin. What is it costing me to keep losing this many people every year? Mm-hmm. And then, therefore, is it a good return on investment for me to do this workforce strategy thing and work with Peoplebench to get this process and these conversations happening to slow down our turnover rates? Some people will find money under cushions to buy that very quickly. And
I would find money under a cushion. And I recommend any of my staff to listen to that part of this podcast, please, so they understand what the cost of turnover is.
Yeah. You know, and as a founder in your own company, if you lose someone that you know and love and knows the business, I don't know, I couldn't even put a multiple on that. That's priceless. Like, you'll do anything. And that's how leaders in schools feel at the moment too. If we just take the hard-nosed fiscal approach out of the picture for a second, you know, for a leader in a school to lose a high-value staff member, which pretty much equals any staff member at the moment, is the weight and the cost of that personally is enormous. I'm sidetracking myself here, but the other category is classic enterprise sales, which is 12 to 18 months. And that can be really depressing. That actually just can be really depressing because the client wants to buy it and you want to sell it, but we're all waiting for their procurement cycle. So
yeah, and that's brutal, especially in education. It's so brutal.
Yeah. They're the times when I remember having met some fantastic founders in Melbourne here in Australia who were doing some great stuff with a SaaS company, but they had also got really involved in a whiskey company. And when they talked to me about the time to stand up a whiskey company and how long investors had to wait for a return on that, I kind of felt okay about our 12 to 18 month sales cycle in education.
Yeah, I guess if you're, comparing it to that, you know, considering lots of that stuff ages, 10, 12 years, for sure. Education's not that long. So that's a great comparison if people are looking into it.
Maintaining perspective. It's one of the resilience factors.
Perspective. I'm going to use that in my pitches, actually. Investing in education's faster than investing in good bourbon. But Fleur, I had an amazing time having a conversation with you. I can't wait to have you on the show again. I'm going to share the heck out of what you guys are doing because I think it can make a tremendous impact in America. And I'm actually going to be with Rita next week. So I will tell her that we had an amazing time on this conversation.
Likewise. I will share the joy, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks, Kyle. It's been great to meet you. I'm really looking forward to staying in touch.
Thank you so much. Enjoy your Saturday.
Take care.